If I could go back 10 years, I wouldn't try to impress the future version of myself with how much pain I could endure, because back then I believed suffering was proof that I was doing something important, that if I was tired enough, stressed enough, isolated enough, then I must be on the right path, and I wore burnout like a badge of honor, thinking that exhaustion meant commitment and sacrifice meant inevitability, but 10 years ago I didn't understand that. Relentless motion without reflection doesn't make you unstoppable, it just makes you blind. I wish I had understood earlier that speed is useless if you're running in the wrong direction. Because I was moving fast, yes, but I wasn't always moving wisely, and I confused urgency with purpose, mistaking chaos for ambition and pressure for progress, when in reality I was often reacting. Instead of choosing, surviving instead of designing, pushing instead of thinking, and if I could go back, the first thing I'd tell myself is to slow down just enough to hear my own thought. Because clarity doesn't arrive when you're drowning in noise, it arrives in silence. And silence was something I avoided at all costs, because silence forces you to face uncomfortable questions, like why you're really doing what you're doing and whether the version of success you're chasing is even yours, or just something you absorbed from the world around you, from expectations, from comparisons, from fear of being ordinary. And 10 years ago I was deeply afraid of being average, afraid of wasting potential, afraid that if I paused, even briefly, I'd fall behind forever, so I kept accelerating, believing that intensity alone could compensate for uncertainty, but intensity without alignment only magnifies mistakes. And I made plenty of them, not because I wasn't intelligent or driven, but because I didn't give myself the space to see clearly, and I wish I could go back and remind myself that thinking is not laziness, rest is not weakness, and patience is not surrender, because some of the most expensive lessons I learned came from rushing decisions that should have matured, from saying yes too quickly, from building things before fully understanding why they needed to exist, and from believing that doing more automatically meant becoming more, when in reality growth comes from subtraction just as much as addition, from removing distractions, removing ego, removing the need to prove something to people who don't even understand your vision. And 10 years ago I was too focused on being seen as capable to ask for help, too focused on appearing strong to admit uncertainty, and too focused on the end goal to care about the cost, not realizing that the cost doesn't wait at the finish line. It accumulates quietly along the way, in strained relationships, in neglected health, in conversations you never had, in moments you told yourself you'd return to later. But later has the habit of never coming, and if I could go back, I'd tell myself that ambition is powerful, but it's dangerous when it's fueled by fear instead of purpose, because fear-driven ambition never rests, it never celebrates, it never feels enough, and no matter how much you achieve, it keeps whispering that you're still not safe, still not proven, still one failure away from irrelevance. And 10 years ago that whisper controlled me more than I'd like to admit, pushing me to work harder, not because I loved the process, but because I was terrified of slowing down, terrified of being overtaken, terrified of becoming invisible. And I wish I had understood sooner that the goal isn't to outrun everyone else, to build something meaningful enough that time itself becomes an ally instead of an enemy. Because when you're aligned with a mission larger than your ego, you stop racing against the clock and start cooperating with it. And that shift alone changes everything: the way you work, the way you think, the way you treat people, and the way you treat yourself. And if I could go back years, I'd also tell myself to pay closer attention to the people who stayed when things were uncertain, not just when things were exciting, because early on it's easy to confuse attention with loyalty, applause with support, and admiration with understanding. But the people who truly matter are the ones who challenge you when you're wrong, ground you when you're drifting, and remind you who you are when success starts distorting your reflection. And I didn't always listen to those people, sometimes because I was too busy, sometimes because I thought I knew better, and sometimes because admitting they were right meant admitting I was wrong. And 10 years ago my ego made that difficult, because ego disguises itself as confidence. But real confidence is quiet, flexible, and curious, while ego is loud, rigid, and defensive. And I wish I had learned earlier to separate the two, because ego builds walls and confidence builds bridges. And the higher you climb, the more dangerous walls become. And if I could go back, I'd remind myself that failure isn't the opposite of success, it's the foundation of it. But only if you're willing to learn instead of repeat, because repeating mistakes at a higher level doesn't make them smarter, it just makes them more expensive. And 10 years ago, I repeated some mistakes simply because I didn't pause long enough to analyze them, to ask what they were trying to teach me, and whether my assumptions were even valid in the first place. And assumptions are incredibly seductive because they save time, but they also steal accuracy, and accuracy is everything when you're building something that hasn't existed before. And finally, if I could go back 10 years, I'd tell myself this one thing above all else: don't build your life as if you're constantly preparing for a future moment where you'll finally start living, because life doesn't begin after the milestone, after the exit, after the recognition, or a F tier, the validation. Life is happening right now, in the middle of uncertainty, in the middle of effort, in the middle of doubt. And if you're not careful, you'll wake up one day surrounded by achievements you don't have time to enjoy, and victories that feel strangely quiet, and you'll realize that the cost of ignoring the present was far greater than the risk of slowing down. And that's something I would have told myself 10 years ago if I had been willing to listen. If I could go back 10 years, I would warn myself that becoming the person you dream of being will quietly demand things you didn't consciously agree to give up, because back then I thought the price of ambition was obvious: long hours, stress, criticism, failure. But what no one tells you is that the real cost shows up in subtler ways, in missed conversations, in relationships that slowly weaken without a dramatic ending, in birthdays you promise to make up for later, and in moments where you're physically present but mentally somewhere else, already think 10 steps ahead. And 10 years ago, I believed I could postpone balance, postpone rest, postpone emotional availability, as if life would patiently wait for me to finish building the future. But life doesn't wait, it keeps moving, and if you're not careful, it moves without you. And I wish I had understood that sooner, because there were times when the world celebrated progress, while my inner world felt increasingly hollow, not because the mission was wrong, but because I neglected the human part of myself that needed grounding, connection, and honesty. And 10 years ago, I rarely admitted how heavy responsibility felt, because leadership is lonely in ways success stories don't capture. And when you're the one expected to have answers, you don't always have the freedom to say you're unsure, so you carry that uncertainty quietly, letting it compound. And I wish I had told myself that vulnerability isn't a liability, it's a stabilizer, because pretending you're unaffected doesn't make pressure disappear, just forces it to surface in other ways, through irritability, distance, insomnia, or the constant feeling that you're behind no matter how much you achieve. And if I could go back, I'd tell myself that not every battle needs to be fought immediately, because urgency has a way of turning everything into an emergency. And when everything feels critical, nothing gets the depth it deserves. And I made decisions under pressure that I would have made differently with time, not because I lacked intelligence, but because perspective requires space, and space was something I rarely allowed myself. And 10 years ago, I also underestimated how much identity can get tangled up with achievement, because when your work becomes your primary source of meaning, failure doesn't just hurt your plans, it hurts your sense of self. And that's dangerous, because it makes you defensive instead of reflective, reactive instead of thoughtful. And I wish I had understood earlier that who you are must be larger than what you build. Otherwise, every setback feels like a personal collapse. And 10 years ago, there were moments when criticism cut deeper than it should have, not because it was unfair, but because I had tied my worth too closely to outcomes. And when you do that, praise becomes addictive and criticism becomes devastating, and neither is a stable foundation. And if I could go back, I'd tell myself to listen more carefully to criticism without letting it define me, because feedback is data, not identity, and ignoring it completely is just as dangerous as internalizing it entirely. And 10 years ago, I also didn't fully grasp how isolation slowly creeps in at higher levels of ambition. Because as responsibility increases, your circle naturally shrinks. Not everyone can relate to the problems you're solving or the risks you're carrying, and that gap can make you feel misunderstood, even in crowded rooms. And I wish I had acknowledged that loneliness instead of rationalizing it away, because naming it gives you the chance to address it, while ignoring it allows it to quietly harden you. And I never wanted to become hardened. I wanted to remain curious, open, and human. But pressure has a way of sharpening edges if you don't consciously soften them. And if I could go back, I'd remind myself that winning at scale doesn't excuse losing empathy, because the higher the stakes, the more essential empathy becomes, not just for others, but for yourself. And 10 years ago, I was far more forgiving of systems than of my own limits, pushing myself past exhaustion while expecting the body and mind to simply comply. And they did for a while, until they didn't. And I learned the hard way that limits don't disappear when ignored, they accumulate interest. and eventually they collect. And I wish I had learned to treat sustainability as a strategy, not a luxury, because endurance matters more than intensity in the long run. And 10 years ago, I also believed that clarity would arrive once certain milestones were reached, once stability was achieved, once success was undeniable. But clarity doesn't come from external certainty, it comes from internal alignment. And no amount of achievement can compensate for unresolved inner conflict. And if I could go back, I'd tell myself to regularly ask, not just, is this working? But is this costing me more than I'm willing to pay? Because some costs are invisible until it's too late. And ambition has a way of convincing you that everything is worth it until you look back and realize some things were priceless. And finally, if I could go back 10 years, I'd tell myself that becoming extraordinary doesn't require abandoning your humanity. That discipline doesn't require emotional numbness. And that strength doesn't mean carrying everything alone, because the goal was never just to build things that last. It was to become someone who could live with what was built. And that lesson took longer to learn than I wish it had, but it changed everything once it finally landed. If I could go back 10 years, I wouldn't try to rewrite the mistakes, because mistakes are not detours from the path. They are the path. And without them, I wouldn't have developed the depth required to understand what truly matters, and that understanding doesn't arrive through success alone. It arrives through contrast, through loss, through moments when the thing you thought would finally complete you doesn't, and you're left alone with yourself asking harder questions than you ever asked when things were going well. And 10 years ago, I thought wisdom would arrive automatically with progress, but wisdom doesn't come from moving forward. It comes from integrating what you've already been through, and integration requires honesty, the kind that doesn't flutter your ego or protect your narrative, but instead forces you to acknowledge who you became under pressure, who you neglected, and who you almost lost along the way. And if I could go back, I'd tell myself to measure success less by distance traveled and more by coherence, by whether your outer achievements and inner values are moving in the same direction. Because when they're not, even extraordinary wins feel strangely empty, and that emptiness is not a failure. It's a signal that something essential has been ignored. And for a long time, I misinterpreted that signal as a motivation problem, thinking I just needed a bigger goal, a harder challenge, or a higher mountain to climb. But what I really needed was alignment. And alignment is quieter than ambition. It doesn't shout. It doesn't rush. It simply feels right. And 10 years ago, I didn't trust that feeling because it lacked urgency. And urgency had become my compass. But urgency is a terrible guide for a life. It's useful in emergencies, not as a permanent state. And if I could go back, I'd tell myself to stop treating every year like a sprint and start respecting the fact that some things only grow at the speed of trust, understanding, and time, and those things include relationships, character, and self-respect. And 10 years ago, I underestimated how deeply self-respect is tied to the promises you keep to yourself, not the ones you make publicly, because it's easy to appear disciplined to the world, but much harder to be honest with yourself. And every time you ignore your own boundaries, rationalize misalignment, or silence your intuition, you trade a little bit of self-trust for short-term momentum, and that trade compounds. And if I could go back, I'd tell myself that rebuild self-trust later is far harder than protecting it early, and that protecting it sometimes means disappointing people, delaying outcomes, or choosing the harder path in the short term to avoid the hollow victory in the long term. And 10 years ago, I also believed that meaning would be found at the edge of innovation, in solving problems no one else could solve. And why? That's partially true. I learned that meaning is not sustained by complexity. One, it's sustained by connection, by knowing who you're building for, why it matters to you personally, and whether your work is an extension of your values or an escape from unresolved emptiness. And that distinction matters more than most people realize, because building to escape never satisfies, it only distracts, and distraction is expensive when it becomes a lifestyle. And if I could go back, I'd tell myself to stop postponing joy, to stop treating happiness a reward that comes after enough progress has been made, because joy is not a distraction from serious work, it's fuel for it. And the absence of joy doesn't make you focused, it makes you brittle. And brittle systems eventually break, no matter how advanced they appear. And 10 years ago, I also didn't understand that legacy is not just what you leave behind, it's what you are like to live with along the way. The energy you bring into rooms, the way people feel after interacting with you, and the example you set when no one is watching. And if I could go back, I'd remind myself that influence without integrity is temporary, but integrity quietly compounds, even when it's not visible. And finally, If I could go back 10 years, I'd tell myself that the goal was never to become untouchable, unbreakable, or beyond doubt. The goal was to become grounded enough to face uncertainty without losing yourself, strong enough to carry responsibility without becoming cold, and ambitious enough to dream big without shrinking fit. People around you, because in the end, the most impressive thing is how far you went. It's whether you remained whole while going there, and that is the lesson I would have wanted to hear 10 years ago, not because it would have made the journey easier, but because it would have made it truer.